Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. I see we already have a couple of people who have joined. Given it's early in the morning, maybe we'll give it a couple of minutes just to allow people to join and then get started. Fantastic. We now have a number of people who have joined, so we will kick off rather. A reminder for everyone that this webinar is being recorded and will be able to be referred back to after the session. The link will be emailed out to those participating and to those who have registered. So, a little bit of housekeeping before jumping into the main content of today's session. The purpose of this webinar is to help New Zealand companies thinking about the European Union with an interest in the energy or clean tech sector, have an understanding of some of the broader dynamics and agenda, along with the changing regulatory landscape and how that could impact some commercial opportunities that you might be thinking about. If we could move to the next slide, I'd first like to just take a moment to introduce us, Flint Global. So we are a global business advisory and consultancy firm with offices in the UK, EU, several European Union member states, and the Asia Pacific region. Myself, I'm a senior advisor with Flint, working in the trade and market access team. My name is George Riddell, and I have sort of worked extensively helping businesses to design sustainable supply chains and navigate some of the more complex geopolitical tensions that are occurring in the world at this point in time. The seminar today will last for about 30 minutes or so, and then after that, there'll be an opportunity for questions at the end. The idea behind this piece of this webinar is based on a piece of work that Flint did for the New Zealand government in 2024, following the implementation of the New Zealand European Union Free Trade Agreement, and really looking at what opportunities there were to support New Zealand export growth as that agreement came into force, and the new opportunities that it presents. If we could move to the next slide. So just taking a step back and looking at the European Union at this point in time in terms of the regulatory landscape when it comes to sustainability. The EU definitely has been one of the global leaders when it comes to green and sustainability efforts. Huge amount of new legislation having been agreed and started to be implemented in the past 5 years. However, there is at the moment a shifting dynamic as some of the regulatory burden of all of those new efforts are becoming apparent to businesses and to those actually having applied the regulation. and looking at ways of delaying certain aspects and simplifying others when it comes to easing the broader burden on businesses and reflecting the current European Commission's mandate on enhancing EU competitiveness. Most notably is some of the omnibus discussions that are taking place in the EU that is looking towards simplification of things like the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which sets a price from next year of embedded carbon for certain products being imported into the European Union, and also other due diligence mechanisms like the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive that is being examined by the different component parts of the European Union, so Commission, Council, and Parliament. Looking at the deforestation regulation specifically, which is a topic of today's seminar, is looking at sort of how this particular regulation is being implemented and what potential opportunities there are as it enters into force from next year and starts to be applied. I think the main aspect of the deforestation regulation is really a desire by the European Union to avoid having the products that are placed on the European single market having contributed to the deforestation of different regions around the world. And I think one of the important components there is that it also applies to European Union producers as well as for products entering the EU. So it's not just an import measure, but it's also something that does have quite significant implications for the European market and European producers themselves. What products are we talking about? So the main commodities that are covered by this regulation relate to soy, beef, palm oil, wood, cocoa, coffee, and also their derived products. So in the case of beef, it's not just the meat products themselves, but also leather. For wood, it can also be looking at pulp and paper, but also certain furniture products as well. So those derivative products are quite an important component of the deforestation regulation. Companies that export these goods into the EU will be required to conduct due diligence and fulfill different reporting requirements to demonstrate that those products haven't been linked in any way to deforestation in order to gain access to the EU market. And I'll go into a bit more detail around what some of those requirements are shortly. Wanting to take a step back as well on sort of why we're talking about the deforestation regulation in the context of New Zealand's competitive advantage. And I think a lot of this is, very apparent in how the EU has assessed the deforestation risk for different countries. And essentially what has happened is you have high risk countries, medium risk countries, and low risk countries. And there is a differing requirement in terms of how and the degree of compliance that those exporters will have to comply with. There are 4 countries who are being classified as high risk. Those high risk countries mostly relate to heavily sanctioned jurisdictions by the European Union, so Belarus, Myanmar, North Korea, and Russia. There have also been certain countries that have been designated as low risk. That includes New Zealand. For the purposes of the deforestation regulation, New Zealand producers are deemed to have a low risk of their products causing deforestation due to some of the national controls and initiatives that are in place in New Zealand. But there are also around 50 or so countries who have been designated as standard risk, and this includes those who are heavily reliant on exporting to the EU. So some examples here are Brazil, Argentina, Indonesia, and Malaysia, who will face a higher regulatory burden as a result of the deforestation regulation when compared to those low risk countries, which I mentioned, New Zealand is one of them. So really looking at some of the potential competitive advantage aspects here with that differentiation when it comes to the classification of New Zealand products entering the European Union from the 1st of January 2026. One thing to also mention here, in addition to the actual deforestation regulation piece as well, is that you obviously have the free trade agreement, which is in place and in force at this point in time between the European Union and New Zealand, which is an additional consideration when looking at the EU as a potential export market, because there are, again, comparatively lower tariffs on several products that fall under the scope of the EU deforestation regulation. In particular, you've got two examples there on the slide: wood products. So, the EU 7% MFN tariff has been removed. And again, beef access, again, increased quota access into the European Union. So it is that potential combination of New Zealand's classification under the EU deforestation regulation together with the free trade agreement that could provide some market access opportunities moving forward. There is also, of course, the sanitary and phytosanitary agreement, which is in place, which is based on the equivalence and streamlined border checks for any agri-food products. So that package together, compared to many of the other markets that look to export to the EU, there is a potential opportunity there moving forward. If we could move to the next slide, please. So I just wanted to spend a bit of time looking at the deforestation regulation itself, as well as sort of highlighting some of the recent amendments that have been made and simplifications to the regulation, because I think for anyone looking at this, although it entered into sort of formally went on the books of legislation over a year ago now, it's only recently that many companies have started really looking in any degree of urgency at the potential changes to the regulation that have been made. So what are the key dates that you need to bear in mind when looking at the deforestation regulation? So if you are a large business or trader, the deforestation regulation starts on the 30th of December 2025, so the end of this year. That 1st of January deadline is when all of these new requirements need to be met for any of those products that I mentioned at the beginning. If you are an SME, and there's sort of very set terminology around how businesses can classify themselves. Essentially, there are thresholds relating to annual turnover and also number of employees. If you fall under that SME category, then the deforestation regulation enters into force on the 30th of June 2026. So there's a 6-month additional grace period for those SMEs when looking at EUDR compliance. Essentially, what do you need to do when it comes to compliance with the EUDR and entering the EU market? You need to guarantee that the products that are being exported are deforestation free, that they have been produced in accordance with domestic laws, and they are accompanied by a statement confirming that due diligence has been carried out and that no risk has been found, or negligible risk has been found that the relevant products are non-compliant. What that means in practice, particularly relating to the produced in accordance with domestic laws, is looking at a lot of compliance when it comes to the different aspects of domestic legislation and forestry, particularly around environmental protection rules, labor and human rights, and land use rights being the main components of that compliance with the domestic laws. It is also possible to use company policies and sort of existing contracts that set out these different aspects of domestic compliance with the laws in conjunction with any sort of legal statements that are possible to ascertain. When it comes to deforestation free, a lot of that comes down to supplier traceability, that there is an awareness of where the products are being produced, on what sort of land those products are being produced, and how it is being done. In terms of what the controls look like for high risk versus low risk countries, so essentially there is going to be a series of compliance checks implemented in the individual EU member states. Products coming from low risk countries, that should be there is an objective of a 1% annual compliance check, for standard risk around 3%, and then high risk 9%. The penalties for non-compliance can be quite severe, ranging from the products being blocked from the EU market through to potential financial penalties in addition to that product ban. So quite significant potential implications if found to be in non-compliance with the EUDR once it has been fully entered into force from next year. In terms of low risk countries traders, of which New Zealand operators and traders will be, there isn't necessarily that requirement to perform the risk assessments or take risk mitigation measures because of that low risk acknowledgement. However, all of the necessary due diligence that I spoke about before around tracking the traceability of the products and that they have been produced in accordance with domestic laws, there is quite a significant obligation, burden, depending on your perspective, placed on companies in order to retain that information, that if the European authorities were to request that information at any point, that you have the necessary audit trails in place in order to submit the information. It is also possible that depending on your particular supply chain and trading into the EU, or potential trading into the EU, if you are working with wholesalers or other intermediaries, that there will be a request for that information to be passed along into sort of other due diligence statements. This will be particularly true if there is any sort of combining of the different products, for example, into different foodstuffs where there is a mixing of different components, that there is very highly probable that suppliers will start asking for this information, even if it may not be sort of strictly necessary in accordance with the sort of EUDR framework as it currently is, with those simplifications for low risk countries, because if the products are combined with those of other countries, so coffee, chocolate being potentially two examples there, that could tip it over into a higher risk classification than it would have been before. The EU has become very aware of some of these challenges around EUDR compliance and has taken steps in April to try and clarify and reduce some of those burdens. So the big changes there, and again, this is on the screen. So due diligence statements can now be submitted annually rather than having to be done on a shipment by shipment basis for companies that fall under sort of those due diligence statements requirements. It will allow the use of authorized representatives to submit a due diligence statement. And also you will be able, if you're a large company, to reuse those due diligence statements if goods are re-imported depending on the particular value chain and trading patterns that you might have. If products are leaving and then re-entering the EU, there won't be this requirement to create a new due diligence statement at every single point of importation. Rather, they will be able to be reused on a regular basis. And there's also clarification around sort of what ascertaining due diligence has been carried out for downstream companies that benefit from the simplified obligations. What that means in practice is essentially there was quite a degree of ambiguity within the EUDR as it was set out in the legal language around what the responsibility of those importers in the EU were in terms of going back to the downstream, sorry, upstream value chain to get the necessary information, and what their obligations were to try and verify that information. There has been a huge amount of clarification around those rules in recent months, which has been certainly welcome by a lot of traders. In terms of what is in that due diligence statement, I would say four main components that are going to need to be set out. The first is standard business identification information, so name, trading number, and address. The second is around the product classification. So in the same way that in a customs declaration or some, other trading documentation, very focused on HS codes, product descriptions, and the quantity of product being imported. The HS codes here are particularly important because that is what will trigger obligations for whether or not a product falls within the scope of the EUDR or not. There is a long list of Annex 1 products within the legislation that if you do have any questions around, is my product covered or not, absolutely going to that annex is the first step in that journey, because that will tell you based on your existing trading patterns whether or not you have products that could be covered by the EUDR. There is also some clarifications there that where a product that is classified under a HS code but not produced with the material covered by the EU deforestation regulation can be excluded. So an example here would be rubber. If you are exporting synthetic rubber to the European Union, it would make no sense that you would have to carry out uh, due diligence on something that could not cause deforestation because it's not natural rubber. It hasn't been produced from trees. So in those instances, products like that are excluded from the scope of EUDR. The third aspect of the due diligence statement is around country of production. So what this says is that you have to have very clear geolocation coordinates of the plots of land that the product has been produced in. Um, that is really requiring quite exact coordinates of the land. Anything over, I think it's 3 hectares, requires the formal matrix of mapping out the land that has been used in order to produce the particular product. I know for many traders, particularly if you're not a primary producer, this has been actually one of the biggest challenges in terms of looking at compliance with EUDR, particularly if you're sourcing from multiple suppliers, is finding all of those coordinates and keeping track of them as to which shipments are going to the EU and which aren't. So in terms of my own experience working with companies looking to comply with the regulations, that aspect of it sometimes has been the most challenging in order to get the exact geolocation. It certainly is possible, and certainly with certain apps on mobile phones, the use of technology has greatly aided the implement, sort of potential compliance around that, but it's not immediately evident and certainly sometimes takes an amount of time in order to gather that particular information. And then it's all about the due diligence statement, pulling that information together with the proper sort of examination that, how the product has been produced in accordance with the domestic laws constitutes a due diligence statement. So some information very easy to ascertain, some a bit more difficult, and then also about the record keeping and making sure that that information is available should it be required from the 1st of January onwards if there are any questions from European authorities. Could we move to the next? Fantastic, thank you. Wanted to talk about the in the final 5 minutes before we move to any Q&A that you might have is around some of the market opportunities within the European Union based on sort of our analysis that we've done over the past year or so. So the first, I think, is, as I mentioned earlier, some of the strongest export opportunities are in scope around wood and wood products and beef, which make up 7% and 6.4% of New Zealand exports, respectively. In terms of the other products covered by the EUDR, like palm oil, coffee, soya, and chocolate, not necessarily as strong market opportunities for New Zealand exporters when looking at the EU. And indeed, in some cases, New Zealand's a net importer of those products. In terms of which EU member states to look at, we know that Germany, France, and the Netherlands have adopted stricter national deforestation policies, which some producers may find it difficult to, or harder rather, to comply with. Indeed, looking at Germany, they have their own national guidelines to encourage deforestation-free agriculture, and they've identified Brazil, Indonesia, Paraguay, and Colombia as sort of high-risk producers. France also sort of a strong domestic stance as well as the Netherlands. Nonetheless, the EU overall is sort of a major importer of wood. So, 14 billion euros worth of wood every year. And together, the Germany, France, Netherlands, and Italy account for over 50% of the EU's total wood imports. So it's one of those situations where even though they have some of the stronger national domestic laws when it comes to looking at the different EU member states, they are the ones where there is a significant demand at this point in time, and particularly with the growth of things like biomass and some of the other construction initiatives that are taking place within the EU at this point in time, is something they're definitely not necessarily going to be able to source domestically, and that trading relationship will become even more important over time. When it comes to beef, we also expect the EU to continue to absorb additional beef imports over the next 10 years, over the next decade, as we are seeing domestic beef production decreasing within the EU. Particularly the largest importers at this point in time of beef products are, again, the Netherlands, Germany, Italy, Spain, and France being the 5 biggest importers at the moment. Right now, in volume terms, Brazil accounts for around 35% of beef imports into the EU, and Argentina at 25%. There is a potential EU-Mercosur free trade agreement currently pending signature and ratification in the EU. That will take time if it is indeed ever enters into force, because of some of the French and other EU member state concerns around some of the competitiveness dynamics and also deforestation concerns of the countries that have been involved in that. So I think one of those opportunities at the moment, particularly we are in a window where both from a trade perspective, so the lower tariffs, the increased quotas, and also the lower degree of the comparatively understanding that it is still a burden, the lower degree of burden experienced by New Zealand exporters could potentially provide that window of opportunity that we've been exploring over the course of this webinar.